Welcome to another episode of Wisdom Personified, Conversations with Dudu Msomi. Today, I'm talking to a very good friend, one of the most chaotic members of our MBA class, Warwick Gill, CEO of Freethinking. Warwick, how are you?
Well, thanks to you, Dudu.
You know, we've known each other since 2005 when we were doing our MBA at GIBS. But I don't think we've ever spoken about your siblings, I mean, your family, what were your interests growing up?
I mean, you met one of my siblings in the MBA. So I was fortunate enough to do my MBA with my brother Graham. But I'm actually the youngest of five. So I've got three sisters who are older than the two of us. We're a close-knit family. So I think, not so much from an extended family perspective, but direct family, we're very close. My brother's now actually in China. I've got a sister in Texas, one in Cape Town and another one in Joburg. And my dad lives down in the Eastern Cape, which is where I normally go on holiday. Grew up in Benoni, so a very supportive family environment. Parents were married until my mum passed, but a very real upbringing as well. So I think I was very fortunate with the amount of support that I had from a family perspective. The focus on things like education and the balance. My mom was a maths teacher, my dad a philosophy major who ended up running the mine safety division of the Chamber of Mines before he retired. So a nice balance between philosophy, literature, and maths and science. I tended more towards the maths and science, but with I guess a very good dose of reality. So we weren't a soft family, the kind of family that if you cut yourself, it would be, stop messing blood on the floor, go to the bathroom, and very real in terms of expectation and I guess quite a bit of tough love as well as the more gentle side. So very fortunate upbringing, and it's typical middle class white South African. I would venture to put it down as.
That explains your tech and maths and science brain. Now you make sense to me, Warwick. Thank you.
Well, to put it in context, I remember when I was about 4 or 5 driving in the car with mom, and she would be firing off times tables at us that we had to respond to. We didn't listen to music in the car. We had maths problems thrown at us. So at a very early age, we've been trained in maths and science.
The things that our parents do. But so now you're the CEO of Freethinking, which is one of South Africa's leading strategic partners for financial services. You call yourselves agents of change. What do you actually do?
So we've shifted slightly. I think our primary industry is still financial services, but we're actively trying to diversify into health, into telecoms, and education, I think primarily, and obviously diversify internationally as well. But to answer your question of what we do, we're a design-led consultancy. So I think many consultancies adopt a process-led or a formulaic type approach to business development and solving business problems. Our approach is based in design and the types of techniques that come around design. So everything from research through to user experience design, user-centered type approaches, service design, those types of components. And what we really do for businesses is we find the correct opportunities and problems to solve, and then we help them solve them in the right way. So to be quite practical, the types of problems you want to be solving are where it's desirable from a customer perspective, feasible from an implementation perspective, and adds value to the business. And we try and work in that sweet spot, and then using techniques like Google Venture type design sprints or design thinking or various other methods to iterate quickly to find the right kinds of solutions to those, drive value rapidly, and then help the businesses transform into a more agile way of working to keep that value coming. So our list of services really do cover everything from business design through to operationalization and everything in between.
Yeah, I know you were trying to help me to set up my online education platform. Work in progress. One day we'll get there.
I've got a far leaner method of doing that, by the way, so we do need to talk again.
Oh, perfect. Do you believe you have a purpose in this life? What is it?
I find that question incredibly difficult because saying yes, I have a purpose almost sounds a little bit arrogant to me. But I sense that I do. if I'm quite honest, there've been a few periods in my life where medically I probably shouldn't have survived, and there's something in me that says that there must be a reason why I did. And if I were to try and articulate that, I think for me it's got very much to do with how to live and how to be your best self and to try and impart that onto others. So I think I've spent some of my spare time growing up, not quite enough recently, trying to work with various foundations in the country, but more from the perspective of helping people see the reality of where they're at, what they have, and what they can do, and to work and be their best within that. And I think that's really what I probably have to impart more broadly, is just how to make the best out of your situation and to own that, and to really be your best self. So I think that's probably my broader purpose, and to try and help people get out of the ruts that they're in. It's not something that I find I dedicate enough time to, and it is something I want to try and reintroduce into the way that I operate. I think after my last attempt with one of the foundations that I won't mention, I kind of gave up a little bit. But I think it is probably time to re-energize and get back into that.
Yeah, but I mean, you're a role model, just the way you live your life. I mean, you do mountain climbing, you do cycling. I mean, you do things that, it's just incredible. But we'll talk about it more just now. You and I tend to have these heart-to-heart talks about race and mainly focus on how we can be better individuals and leaders in the world in which race can impact opportunities and the quality of our lives.
Yes.
How do you interact with the concept of race, and what opportunities do you think you have been blessed to get because of your race?
Yeah, so another complicated question. For me, race is a label, and I struggle with the concept of labels. I think when we talk about disability, and I also struggle with concepts of being disabled or differently abled or anything else that people try and create to box people and expectation. But I think it's clearly very, very relevant as from a historical perspective and from the way that it has been used, not only in this country, but particularly in this country. And I see it as one of the many ways that we label people, and that creates bias or informs our conscious and our unconscious bias. And I think it can be limiting in allowing people to reach their full potential. And I think it limits the diversity that people can bring into an organization. So I think I think there are many things that we use unintentionally or intentionally to justify our bias or to hang our bias on. And I think race is a primary component within that. The way that I try and interact with it, I think, is to get to the core of understanding the bias that it has created in us. I think one of the sessions that you hosted at GIBS many years ago now, you had a speaker there who spoke about recovering racists versus people who are not racist, and that recognition that just based on history, I'm a recovering racist and likely will be for the remainder of my life, and to be crucially aware of that and what that bias informs in my thinking, and at the same time to be actively challenging that and having the conversations that allow me to challenge it and allow me to understand it better. And I think that for me is really I'll try and engage with it is to get people independent of race to have those conversations about their bias, about where it comes from, so that we can continually challenge it and be better, and allow people to reach their full potential and to embrace the different thinking and the different value and benefit that comes out of that thinking into our personal lives and into business.
Yeah. Do you label yourself as disabled or differently abled? Last year you invited us to engage with you on diversity, because as the CEO of Freethinking, you're very passionate about ensuring that you create an inclusive environment.
Yes.
And then you spoke a little bit about your experiences as a disabled or differently abled person. I was shocked at myself because I realized that I've never seen you as disabled or differently abled. And so I've never really considered what the challenges you live. I really had never until you mentioned it. You're an active cyclist. You do mountain climbing. You're highly intelligent. You're hilarious. What wisdom can you share on how we can see and live diversity so that we can create an inclusive, emotional and physical space for everyone? And do you think that is feasible?
The short answer to that is yes, I think it is feasible, but I think it takes change from everyone. And that speaks a little bit to my personal purpose, is that I don't see myself as disabled or differently abled. I have had organizations who've tried to classify me as that from a reporting perspective. And I do get invited into diversity forums to represent the voice of disabled and differently abled people. And I personally struggle with that because, for me, physical capability is just a capability, much like emotional intelligence or IQ or any of the other types of abilities that are out there. And I struggle with the fact that it's often seen as separate. For me, my kind of contribution into diversity forums has normally been as short as an escalator ride, where my commentary has been make sure that we can get to our desks, make sure that we can get to the bathrooms, that we can have access to water, tea, coffee, and that we can get out in an emergency. And other than that, expect us to do our job and to do it as well as any other person and to get there based on merit. And I think that's where the dual-sided component of it comes in for me, is that in my challenges in dealing with some of the organizations around disability where I've attempted to get involved, is that I get the sense that people want special treatment and they want the ability to hold the position of CEO, but to not go to work if their knee is sore. And you can't have both. There's an expectation of the role and the position, and it's very self-limiting to want compensation or to expect that you're going to be treated differently and somehow hold the same position. I mean, if you can't do the job because of your physical capability, it's not. It's like me. I would have loved to have been a game ranger, as a simple example. I physically can't be one. Now I can moan at the game ranging industry for not accommodating me. But the reality is that I'm just physically not capable in the same way as somebody could be, mentally not capable of taking on other jobs or emotionally not intelligent enough for certain jobs. And, to be real about that and to then work with what we have and what we can do, I think is the responsibility of the disabled community. And that for me is the balance that we need to get right in organizations, is that, and you'll see it as a theme in the conversation, that accountability and ownership of what's reasonable and what accommodations should be in place and can you do the job, and then living up to our full potential. So it's not about organizations adapting. I think there's basic human needs that organizations need to make sure they can take care of, and then there's that real conversation between the person and the organization as to what's possible, what's feasible, and how best to achieve that for the benefit of both. And I think the conversation is often skewed towards the accommodation side, whereas there are real practical considerations that need to be in place, and it's recognizing that.
It's an interesting area, I must say. We use those terms so loosely, but and I think it's the same thing as a race. Like a white person will tread very softly, and I think we're also treading very softly when it comes to differently abled or disabled, whatever. So it's a conversation that I think for myself I'd like to engage more on. Now, the question that I'm interested in, is there unfair discrimination amongst the differently abled communities? Is there a perceived hierarchy? Do you have ideas on how to create an equitable culture in these communities so that they can interface more powerfully in advancing their interests as disabled or differently able people in the world?
So that's a very complicated question, as I think you'll recognize in asking it. And I think I'm going to answer it in two ways. I'm going to answer it, one from a very personal perspective of how I've experienced it, and very real. And I think secondly, I think from a broader perspective, that goes beyond disability, and I think goes into privilege, and the impact that can have. So I think, to answer it from a personal perspective, I wouldn't say that there's a hierarchy, but there's a classifiable versus non-classifiable, that I've experienced quite personally from the perspective of trying to prepare for the Olympics. I had intent in around 2012 to actually try out for the Paralympic team, and at cycling, and to hit the kind of 40 to 80k range in the cycle races and compete internationally. I was unable to, validly. I want to be quite clear on that, because my disability doesn't fall into a decent category. So if you're missing a leg or you can't use your legs, that's classifiable. For me, because I've got arthritis and impacts on lots of joints across the body, they tried to sort of classify me either with somebody who would need to be on a tandem, which is unfair on me, because I can't even use full length cranks as an example. So there's no ways I can put out the same power as a person who just has who's blind, as an example, who would normally be on a tandem, so because my legs are impacted. But it's also unfair for me to compete from the opposite perspective of a hand cyclist, because I can still utilize my legs. So there's no category that my type of disability falls into, and as a result, you end up not being able to compete on certain stages. Strangely enough, I find that entirely fair, because any of the categories, and the categories are necessary to allow fair competition, and I've either got an advantage or a disadvantage in any of them in which I can be classified. So I have to accept the reality that I can't compete at an international stage and find other things to do. And I think that's where the realism part comes in for me. So I think it is, there's a lot of focus on, from a business perspective, from a sports perspective, on the traditional types of disabilities. I think the more blended disabilities and the less visible disabilities are discriminated against unintentionally, and I think it's largely because people don't know how to deal with it. And I think when you start getting into mental conditions, I think it's a hell of a lot worse. I think that mental has a stigma attached to it. I think we lose a lot of value that those people can bring into organizations and can bring into society. And I think we force a lot of the conversation of that to be even more underground than with physical disability. And I think that the world needs to start understanding that as much as we attempt to on the physical side, and work out how best to leverage people for their core and for their strengths.
Yeah. That is something I think we all should mull over. It's a complicated one, Warwick. I really was not aware how complicated it is.
Yeah.
What do you think your unique value proposition is? If you were not here tomorrow, which I hope you will be around for a long time, but what do you think we'll miss about you?
So I think I spent a lot of time on this question, because I'm trying to find a way of articulating my value proposition for myself. But for me, I think my unique value proposition is my breadth of thinking and the context that I'm able to take. So I see myself as a systems thinker, as a business strategist, and my engineering background, I think, as well helps me with just contextualizing things in ecosystems and in cause and effect type of thinking. And through that, I hope that I can get to solving the real core problems that sit below the items, rather than just looking at symptoms. My sense in my 20 odd years of experience is that that's a relatively rare and unique skill. I have met some of my mentors, as an example, have been brilliant at that, but I do find that it's quite unique in the business world. And I think that that will be missed. But I think even more than that, if I were not here tomorrow, and this is from feedback that I've received throughout my career, just my ability to center people, to create context, to put things back in real context. One of our lecturers at GIBS, his name escapes me at the moment, but it was a personal leadership style of lecture where he started with just really contextualizing how relatively insignificant we are. I mean, I remember very clearly of the zooming in on a piece of a fly's eye and then slowly zooming out until you get the context of the universe, and just recognizing that my decision that I'm making about free thinking today is not life and death. It isn't going to impact climate change. It's not going to impact education in South Africa, let alone the what's going on in the universe. And I think that ability to just bring people down to the reality of the importance of the decision that they're taking and the context that it's within, and to center them and calm them, and just allow us to plan through the process. I mean, the last year has been a crisis year, and that level-headedness and context in crisis, I think people will miss. And then I think on a personal level, hopefully my humor,
your dry sense of humor.
But hopefully that helps us have harder conversations periodically. But yes, I think my humor will be missed as well. And my dogs will miss me feeding them. But other than that, I recognize I don't have that much more.
And your wine collection.
Yeah, my ability to bring good wine to parties, but that will be missed.
Yeah. What is your Achilles heel, and how do you prevent it from adversely impacting other aspects of your life that make you successful?
So I think, like many people, I think one of my key strengths is also my Achilles heel, and for me that is my independence. And I've fought, a little bit of my story. I fought very hard to be able to be independent, and I think I have an unreasonable fear of losing that. And I think that becomes my Achilles heel in. If I see something not being done the way I would want it to, or not being done as well as it could, or in my perception, people are being too slow in picking something up, I tend to take over, and I tend to do it myself. So, one of my colleagues the other day joked that, I might be taking on a little bit too much, being the CEO of the organization, principal consultant, IT support, and various other things that I just pick up when they need to be done. And I think it has a number of impacts. One, it overworks me and distracts me from working on necessarily the key priorities. And secondly, it disempowers unintentionally the people around me, who are very qualified, very capable, and may not just be working as fast or as directly as I would want them to. And I would love to say I've got it completely under control. As recently as 2 days ago, I found myself taking over something that I shouldn't be. So it's a constant learning for me. It's a constant challenge. And I think that the way that I try and deal with it is to tell the people that work with me that it is a challenge that I have, to help me identify it, to help me point it out, and to almost protect me from doing it too often. And
protect you from yourself.
Yeah, and to just be honest with me, and to call me and to tell me when they're seeing the kind of behavior, so that I can pick it up. And then I'm obviously trying to introspect as much as I can, to be aware of it and pick it up myself, to deal with it. But I think its biggest impact is probably its ability to disempower those around me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge for all leaders. I mean, there's a work that I do around operational versus strategic leadership, and to be able to always balance those two, especially at the executive level, it's always a challenge for leaders, but it's something that can be done. You just need to trust your direct reports and your employees. It's work in progress, I'm sure. What are the top 2 trends in the world that you are seeing in how people live and spend their money that financial services must take into consideration if they want to remain relevant?
I think my view on this is probably slightly non-traditional, but it is my perspective. And I think the first key one is a distinct move away from the concept of ownership. So I think we've moved into a transaction and experience-based economy. The traditional financial services are built very much on asset ownership, on things like collateral. You try and get credit without collateral. It's very difficult and very expensive, as a simple example. You take that into an insurance industry. Primarily, insurance insures assets, so houses, cars, goods. And I think that the focus on ownership is changing, and people are simple things like ride sharing, Uber, they symptoms of that. As you start bringing in things like autonomous vehicles, the need to own possessions is going to significantly reduce, and I think we're moving far more back towards community, enabled through things like social media. And I don't think that financial services have really wrapped their head around what impact that's going to have on how they do business. And what do insurers insure if it's not assets? And when you start bulking these types of components and start moving towards self-insurance, what starts happening in the insurance industry? So I think for me, that's the first big trend. I do see some of the banks starting to deal with it in some of the societal banking type options that are coming out, and those types of initiatives. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. And then I think the second thing, and this is broader than financial services, there's particularly in the last year, I think it's starting to take effect, is that people are really starting to care about societal impact. So the focus on short-term profit, the focus on the short term, and not on the broader mid and long-term impact on what we do. I think for me is a very, very interesting trend that all organizations need to be watching. I was reading something that was sent to me by one of my colleagues in the last week, just around, as an example, the impact that Uber has had on traffic, where it's unintentionally increased traffic, where one of its original purposes was to try and find a more sustainable way of having transport. I think those types of things are going to become important in organizations moving forward. Is when profit starts overriding some of those initial intents and some of the broader societal impact, I think the consequence is going to be greater, and I certainly hope so. One of my personal driving factors is around fairness, and the Freethinking purpose is good before profit. I think that societal impact is going to start having a big impact on the way that businesses operate and what's seen as being important.
Interesting. Before we close off, because me and you can chat forever, and we do. You've had a lot of challenges. You never thought you would live this long.
Yes.
What is that like? What does it do to your psyche, and what does it do to you appreciating living?
So, one of the sort of prep questions that you provided to prompt thinking, was around vision, and I think what it does, and it was never intentional, but I think what it might have resulted in, let's put it that way, is that I'm not a vision-driven person, because I'm not. There's no inherent risk of particularly right now, me having a shorter life than intended. I think a lot of that was in my youth, but I think having gone through that and the uncertainty of not knowing what I'm physically going to be capable of tomorrow. So I do replace my parts when I need to, but at the moment I'm loving my cycling. I don't know when my right knee's going to give out, and I'm going to have to stop that and put in a new one. I think it's shifted me from rather being goal driven and vision driven into being principle driven and hopefully a little bit more purpose driven. So I think for me, what's more important than vision is just living life according to the principles that you put in play, trying to balance that short term with the medium term and the long term, and still live with that long term in mind, even though it's not guaranteed, and frankly, it's not guaranteed for anyone.
Yeah.
But to leave that legacy of more the how did I do things, what did I see as important, what did I change, how did I enable people around me, rather than he had a lofty vision but didn't manage to get there for whatever reason. And with the uncertainty, often those visions are fairly pointless anyway. It's the principles and the values that help you navigate the landscape. And I think that for me is probably one of the major shifts, is that it's become far more important for me to get that right than it is to necessarily have a 5-year vision or a 10-year vision for myself or a company or any other kind of environment.
Interesting. You're going to make me rethink, because I do a lot of work in personal leadership, and vision is one way of rooting a lot of that work. As much as I believe in values and principles, I think are core. So you're going to make me rethink how I interface those elements. But before we go, Can you just give us your last wisdom? If this is the last thing you share with the world, what do you want us to remember as human beings?
No pressure.
None at all.
So I think another question that I find quite a difficult one to answer, but I for me it really is around be aware of your locus of control. I think some of the primary challenges I face in business is just individuals who are so buffeted by what goes on around them, rather than truly understanding or just going through that continual journey of understanding themselves, and understanding their response and the accountability of that response. There's so much blame, there's so much lack of recognizing your own personal role, your own thinking, your own bias. So to really get that introspection, to develop the accountability that often comes from that, and that personal ownership of consequence, and the acceptance of consequence. I mean, my entire life is a balance between choice and consequence. If I decide to cycle 150 Ks, I need to understand I'm going to be sore for 2 weeks. I can't then complain that I'm sore for 2 weeks. And that's a simple example. But to develop that, to take that accountability, and then with that accountability is the understanding, and the understanding of your environment, the understanding of what's around you, and then to only propagate what you know. The gossiping is another simple example of just something that is so inherently wrong in the world. And if I look at the business challenges, I would say 30%, 40% of the challenges that I had during COVID was just people propagating information that they'd heard from others, hadn't taken the time to confirm, and yet still thought it was worth, and they weren't experts in it. So they didn't trust the experts. They didn't take the time to understand themselves, and still felt that they could continue propagating the information. And to just be aware of that and try and cut it down, and to be only propagate what you know is true. Choose to trust where you don't, and you don't have the time, and to just be quiet where you don't do either. It's to get that right on a personal level, and to take that ownership forward, I think would really be the wisdom that I would like to share. It's nothing particularly big or massive, but for me,
that is big. That is big, Warwick. I believe in choices and consequences. I'm not brag a bit, so that you can go and check it out. My TEDx talk that I've it's just come out is about that, but also living with no fear and no regrets. So choices and consequences are so important. And can you understand why I'm having a conversation? Though I've known Warwick since 2005, every engagement I have with him is more enriching, and I'm always a better person for knowing him. Thank you again for joining us, and do subscribe. We need to have 2021 as a year where we have 1 million followers. Help us get there. Until next time.
Please don't forget to subscribe, and for future notifications, please press the bell so that you are the first one to know.